So Napoleon comes up around the year 1800. He's a minor. He was originally a minor French officer who ultimately becomes emperor of France. But why Napoleon is important is that I mentioned earlier, he is the great disruptor. During this time, this culture we're going to call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a fantastic time in Western history. It actually is after the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is a reawakening of back to the Greek, the pagans, the Greek and the Romans, and that was after the Dark Ages, the Middle Dark Ages, which were really just influenced strongly by Christianity. Well, the Renaissance said we can look into the world and not be too scared, or we can at least look into the world. The Enlightenment took it to a whole new degree. We can study the world, we can look into the world, and we can be confident in ourselves to actually understand and shape the world. And so that's why sciences grew, everything grew. Philosophy, art, even military science. We might call it military science, but everything just developed and developed. And ultimately, people became really fascinated, or really compelled to use formulas. If you send an army out into the field, you lay them out to a certain extent, certain disposition. They're composed of certain people. How do we know that? Because we did some science. We studied the best ways to deploy, to fight. So there's a real formulaic way of fighting. Well, Napoleon comes in and really just upturns everything. Whereas the old armies would fight in lines, what we call lines. You see those guys shoulder to shoulder, they fight. Napoleon would actually just send columns into the lines and break them up. Whereas old armies, traditional armies, put their artillery, they scattered them around their troops. Napoleon would mass his artillery, blast a hole, and then those columns would march through. Napoleon would actually divide his forces into large units, make them go out, they're spread out, and you really didn't know where he was going. It was totally unconventional. And all these generals that he fought conventionally, and Napoleon just disrupted it. So he really set the standard of warfare. And one more thing about Napoleon. Back in those days, armies were an asset to a nation. So think about this. If you take young men or men, you take them, you put them in a military force, that force is not creating a value. You're actually taking people out of the economy. So these nations would take forces. They might have small armies, but to be very well trained over years and years of training. They really well developed. They become an asset. If you send your army out, you don't want to get destroyed. If you get destroyed, first of all, you've lost all that experience, all that training, all that equipment. Now you got to take people again out of the economy to make a new army. Nations really weren't interested in that. So back in those days, prior to Napoleon, warfare was called wars of maneuver. And what would happen is these armies would actually try to go around one another. They would maneuver around trying to defeat their opponent, make their opponent, compel them to surrender so they wouldn't die. Like, look, you're surrounded, there's no way out of here, surrender, and we'll get some money from your nation and you'll go back home. Very simple. Napoleon comes in and says, you know what, no more wars of maneuver. We're going to fight wars of annihilation. We're going to destroy these armies. And in doing so, he actually toppled governments. It was unheard of. So it really was the ultimate disruptor. So that's important because Clausewitz actually becomes, Clausewitz tries to explain Napoleon. He tries to explain why Napoleon was so successful despite all the years of this wars of maneuver. That's a really important point. The second point is philosophy. Now I mentioned earlier the culture called the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, again, it's the idea that we use knowledge comes from the senses. Everything's objective. Everything can be turned into a science. It really can be. Well, during the 1800s, or growing into the 1800s, 19th century, there became a counter-Enlightenment movement, and the Germans make this. It's called Romanticism. And what Romanticism is actually known as a counter-Enlightenment. The Romantics say, you know what? It is true that the universe is intelligible to a certain degree. It is true. But there are certain things which are not intelligible. There are certain things which cannot be measured. They would say, look at man's will, or spirit. You might call a fire in the belly. How do you measure that? You can measure a table, you can measure a wall, you can measure the glass, you can do all that. But how do you measure a man's or woman's passion? How do you do that? They say you can't. And that shows that there are certain things in this world which are not objective, they're not intelligible perceptually. There's some things just beyond our senses. And this is where you really get into emotionalism, emotion over reason over logic. And I think the best way to explain what this really means, imagine, well, I'll give you an example. I live near a hospital, an emergency center. This place just represents the height of knowledge, the height of science. Think of the years of just study of medical research, of creating hypotheses and identifying contradictions and actually get down to the real medical remedy. Years of dedicated scientists of just being totally objective. That's the height, the epitome of objectivity, the science of medicine. Across the street from this hospital, though, is a card reader. So this is almost an element of Romanticism. The fact that you could have a organization which is based on natural phenomena of objective reality, and across the street, and it's in business obviously for a while now, you have mystics, you have people who are interested in the supernatural. That really is a remnant of what you call irrationalism, and that's really what the Romantics brought in. There are certain irrational aspects of life that we can tolerate and that we can't necessarily understand, but they're there. That's really an example of the remnant of Romanticism, or at least irrationality. So taking both Napoleon and the idea of irrationality, the idea that there are some things which cannot be measured, such as willpower. You take those two, and they're going to have basically enormous influences on Clausewitz ideas. And now we're going to go into some of those ideas. If you like this video, please hit like and share it with your friends. Look, the more people who like Ed's challenges and watch it, the greater the impacts to community, business, and leaders.